G'day, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Military Mindset for Business podcast. My name's Pete Liston. I'm your host, and I've been really looking forward to this one because I want to unpick and have a bit of a scratch around ethics and what the right thing to do. How do we actually, put our moral compass, set it in the right direction, and have that set the pathway on where we're going. And today I'm speaking to a good friend of mine, Vedran Maslic. Mate, how are you today?
G'day, mate. How are you? Good.
I'm good. So, Maz and I,
Yeah, that's right.
We served together in the military. He's an entrepreneur. He's got an amazing story of coming to Australia, why he served the military. Here after the military, I know he spent some time back in Sarajevo, gym freak, CrossFit guy, gym owner. But now he's back in Australia, still serving in the military, currently doing a CDO fellowship and research study on military ethics, and also studying a PhD. So, Maz, how are you going today, mate?
Good, mate. How you going, Pete? Thanks for having me, firstly.
It's a pleasure.
It's always odd being on this side of the microphone.
I know. So, hey, just a quick plug. Let's plug the Maz podcast.
Well, I mean, the Voices of War, right? So that's certainly one big aspect of my current endeavors. So I host a show, much like you do, that seeks to, I guess, unpack or seeks to give voice to those who are otherwise not often heard, but have some experience or understanding of war. And that's merely to scratch below what I often call the simple narratives of war, right? The black and white narratives that dominate our mainstream and even social media.
And I always start these episodes with, why did you get to the army? Tell us a little bit about your backstory. How did you get to Australia? It's a story in itself. And how did you end up in the military?
I'll try to keep it as short as possible because it is a long-winded story. So I was born and raised in Bosnia and Sarajevo, as you alluded to, which is where I went back to ultimately for a couple of years. But it was at the age of 10 that the peace I'd enjoyed up until then, I guess, ceased with the siege of Sarajevo, which many of your listeners will be probably familiar with, of the early 90s, or the dissolution of Yugoslavia. And then, of course, the war in Bosnia, which, lasted for, 3.5, 4 years. So I was lucky that I only stayed in Sarajevo for a couple of months. My brother and I managed to flee on the second last UN convoy to ever leave the city. Dad, as a fighting age male, had to stay behind because with our surname, Maslic, which is, somewhere, culturally, ethnically Muslim, somewhere in the background, as much as my family hasn't been religious for at least 3 generations that we know of. Had my dad tried to leave with that surname, he would have been killed at the first checkpoint or dragged away into one of the concentration camps that were popping up around the country. So my brother and I settled in Germany for 3.5 years as refugees, which in itself was an interesting experience, but it certainly gave me some unique insights into the life of those who are not fortunate or life of those who are unfortunate to have to flee their country. And the number of those is growing, obviously, as we speak right now, not least from Ukraine, but many other parts of the world. So I was again lucky that my dad survived. He joined us in Germany. We then migrated to Australia as skilled migrants. Both parents are highly skilled. Dad's an engineer, mum's a physics professor. So sought after industries. And again, I count myself as lucky that they had those professions, which afforded us a new life in a country like Australia. And for anybody who's ventured beyond the shores of this continent/country, I'm sure they recognize quickly as the wheels touch down back in on home soil how lucky we really are over here. Yeah. But why did I join the army? Truth be told, I was from 3 years of age I used to walk around introducing myself as Vedran Maslic soldier. So I've always had an affinity for the uniform. I loved the idea of service. There's a nobility to this profession that's deeply infused, I guess, as we'll come talk about it as well, is with the ethics of the profession, is helping those who can't help themselves. And I think my experiences in Bosnia, I guess, solidified that opinion or that view of that profession, because I've been helped by a number of foreign soldiers as we departed Sarajevo. And I know my dad was also helped by a number of foreigners throughout his experience of that war. So, you know, there was really no question that I would join. It was just a matter of when rather than if. And yeah, I was fortunate then to join in 2004 and meet people like yourself and many of our other peers.
Mate, I just don't want to just gloss over this whole how you left Bosnia piece. How old were you and your brother in Germany, and were you by yourselves?
So I was 10 and brother was 13, so he's 3 years older than me. We were by ourselves, as in mum was with us, but the three of us were by ourselves. We actually left Sarajevo with my aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins. So we were the 7 of us were piled into a VW Golf 3 Series, and for anybody who knows anything of those cars knows that there's not a lot of space in those cars. But the way it was kind of sold to the multiple checkpoints that we had to pass by the various warring factions and paramilitaries and etc. Was that it was actually my uncle who has a Serb name, right, which is the only reason he was allowed to leave, despite the fact that he was questioned a number of times as to when he's going to come back to defend the homeland by various Serb forces that we met along the way. But it was actually my mum that was supposedly his wife, and the rest of us were kids because my aunt, my mum's sister, was rather youngish looking. So there was, 5 of us piled on in the back, supposedly all as kids of these 2 adults at the front, which was an anecdote that we often laughed at in the years subsequent. But thinking about it now, I mean, that's survival. You just go and do what you have to. And despite the fact that this was a UN-sanctioned convoy, we were shot at, as in the convoy was shot at. There were people dragged away from the convoy, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't at all a safe exit or a safe passage, as one might have believed, just because of the UN association.
It's really, again, I'll come back to a bit of your point about, I guess, some of the naivety of being just a regular Australian growing up in a regular town. Is we've just got no idea about, the average Australian would have no idea about these experiences. And just, one of the things for me is, without getting down too much of a rabbit hole, with the atrocious situation about why people come on boats and this kind of stuff. But would you really put your family into that situation unless there was something critical? And man, just without going into too much of a tangent, what's it saying, a national anthem, with boundless plains to share, like God, we gotta do a bit more sharing. But anyway, that's another.
I mean, just a short comment on that. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree, and it's I've been rather vocal on that point as well. I mean, the problem is with Australia, it's been a political hot potato. The couple of thousand illegal immigrants, let's call them that, trying to find asylum. But then you look at countries like Germany, who took 100,000 people in the first hit of the Balkan War, Sweden, who took 60,000. And, these people ultimately ended up boosting the economy because people who flee their circumstances and are then welcomed somewhere, believe it or not, they actually work hard and want to pay back. Yeah, exactly.
And on that note, I was, I know you've got a strong connection to Turkey, and I was in Istanbul, Turkey, and I was in Istanbul a couple of months ago. And talking to some of the people in Istanbul, I think there was like 1 million extra refugees from Syria.
There are 3 million sitting on the border right now with basically with Europe, right?
And these are numbers we just can't even fathom in Australia. We go down to Sydney Harbour on New Year's Eve, and the fact there's 200,000 people there, it feels like a bit of a crush, mate.
Exactly.
We could digress down this path all day. Let's see where the rabbit holes go. I'm not scared to go down a few, but mate, you've gone into the military, and it just seems like a natural progression that you went into intelligence corps. What's life like as an intelligence officer?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I guess it depends on what kind of intelligence officer you are, right? Because there's obviously, we're all trained to be, your S2 type, your battalion S2, brigade S2, etc. That I guess collates information to brief a given commander on the battle space, right? So forewarned, forearmed. It's understanding what the enemy, whoever that enemy might be, or even civilians, non-combatants in an area, what they might do, given our presence in a particular area of operations. That's your kind of bread and butter as an intelligence officer. But for me, I've never done that job. As much as I'm an intelligence officer, I've never gone down the mainstream intelligence path. I specialized fairly early on in my intelligence career, and I focused on human intelligence or source operations, which, again, for those who are not familiar, is basically cultivating relationships of trust with those who might have information of utility for the commander in winning that battle or the war. In short, it's running spies basically, but that's the long-winded way to say it.
Cultivating trust sounds like, somewhat nefarious, if that's even the right term, use of what we would do with that trust once we've actually cultivated and sown the seeds and reaped the rewards out of it. And I guess this is where some of the things that I want to unpack in this conversation, bringing it back to, military mindset for business, is understanding our own intelligence space in business, and what we look at and how we look at our competitors and what other people in other stakeholders are doing. Before we get there, tell us about some of your roles that you actually did in this human space. Have you got any stories that you're willing to share about, different, understanding that there are security clearances and all of that, about different experiences that you've had in that role?
I mean, the things that are obviously, out in the public domain is deployments to Afghanistan. And that's where we had a significant footprint as a capability. And I was one of the officers who deployed in charge of a field human team. And of course, the team itself was tasked with, cultivating that access and trust with those individuals who might be able to support, our or answer our information requirements to inform decisions made in the battle space. And that's without a doubt a pinnacle and highlight of my career. Apart from that, I've been involved in some other roles that are, I guess, associated with human intelligence, but mainly in training and preparing guys to go overseas, which is something I still do even today. I still teach at some of our specialist intelligence collection courses, with a particular focus on interpersonal and intercultural communication and weaving the idea of ethics. Because, of course, as anybody listening can imagine, the entire industry of running, spies is hugely ethically challenging and difficult to digest, I guess, because, as many have argued before me, the profession in itself is ultimately unethical in many ways, because you're using people, ultimately, cultivating trust, as we discussed before, which feels real, but generally is not, in order to get information from them. So you have to be ultimately very, very careful with how those skill sets and how those and the right personalities that are in those types of capabilities, who are able to walk that fine line of, what's okay and what's not.
Well, man, the first thing I can think of is I wish we had a campsite with a fire and about a dozen beers each to really sit down for about 5 or 6 hours and unpack some of this, but let's try and keep it podcast gestable. Because one of the things I'm going to come back and unpack this ethics thing at the moment. And from you, with your experiences coming out of Bosnia as a refugee, seeing direct actions of people that were either just or unjust, and having that becoming a very definitive driver of your character and your next career path in life. Like, I honestly joined the military because I wanted a job that was purposeful, that was intentful, and where I was a contributor doing the right thing. And one of the things I'm always very passionate about, talking about veteran entrepreneurship in particular, is that you should choose a veteran business because the people behind that business are going to act with integrity and, commitment, and they're actually going to do the right thing for you. But I'm always confused with this oxymoron between us being professional military officers, or me in a former life and you in a current life, and this balance between the things that we believe and the reasons why we act versus how we act. Because ultimately, one of the things we need to do to win in warfare is to deceive, and feint and manipulate and ultimately kill. Now, when we look at military people, we sort of say, well, we have these high values and ethics, but in business, we sort of think, well, business is a bit more dubious and unethical, but in military, we just go so much further. Can you just unpack some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess going to the first point of why people joined, I mean, in my instance, it absolutely was driven by that kind of a moral dimension of, trying to help those who couldn't help themselves, right? So that was the reason I joined. And the reason I was able to join intelligence and do human intelligence was ultimately, again, because I believed, at least to an extent, that what we stood for as a military, what the Australian Defence Force stands for as a military, what the Australian nation stands for as a nation, is broadly right, righteous, good. And therefore, our intentions and the wars that we've deployed to, ultimately, at least at an individual level, were motivated by good intentions, which is how you can then, of course, allow yourself to do certain things that in the everyday life would be seen as immoral or unethical. And this is where we need to draw a distinction between war and everyday life. War exists as something out there. War exists, and war is understood by people, by nations, by leaders as an anomaly, right? It is an anomaly to everyday life, to our other social norms, right? Which is why we can accept that in war, in fact, we have laws that will allow soldiers to do things that would otherwise in day-to-day life be seen as unethical, but to do it in war, in fact, be forced to do it, i.e. kill or be killed, right? Which, if you were, as a banal example, if you're walked outside your house and just shot someone in the street, chances are you'll end up in jail. But if you did that walking through somewhere in a part of Afghanistan, and you saw somebody about to kill you and did that, well, you'd be praised for it even. So that's where war stands outside of what is accepted as day-to-day life, and it's temporary. It's something that we go and do, and hopefully it's short in duration. But ultimately, all wars end, and war as a state of being ultimately is an anomaly to otherwise a peaceful coexistence, despite the fact that we consistently seem to be there's continuously some sort of a war. And I guess that's why the military ethics as a field is so critically important, because you're sanctioning the use of violence and killing on behalf of the state, right? So, the old adage that war is an extension of politics, right? It's for some political end state, for some policy end states that you're pursuing a war or violence, and because of that, because you're already stepping outside of what is the norm or what is commonly acceptable in our societies domestically, there is a greater risk of moral degradation, of moral drift, of ethics becoming, discarded for tactical, operational, strategical gains. And that's, not me saying that about our military, but I'm saying that about every military, right? Transgressions have occurred in every war. War crimes have occurred in every single war, and will continue to occur in every single war, because war in itself is not the normal state of being, which is why people can do the most extraordinary things in war.
I think that's a really important point, and I like your term of the use there, anomaly, and it is a short-term shift from the normal, but it takes a certain kind of character or person to have that sense of integrity and purpose and character in the normal, to be able to go and do some of those things in the abnormal situation and hopefully return and to make those decisions in the abnormal setting with the best balance, with the best purpose, with the best sense of, doing the right thing here.
Yeah.
Look,
I think this is why the purpose matters, right? This is why the reason we go to war matters, right? And this is why, this is something I explore in my own podcast through various thinkers, why, at least anecdotally, I strongly believe that our spike in moral injury, PTSD, etc., amongst the veteran communities is partially because the purpose of the wars we have fought over the past 20 years has been somewhat diluted, has been questioned. Certainly in the cases of Iraq, has certainly been put under the microscope, and we've been left wanting. Afghanistan, the way we left, that certainly had a significant impact on those who've been, as to why, what for. All of these kind of decisions made by the political elite, but ultimately it's the soldiers on the ground who have to contextualize those reasons for going and live and breathe it, right? Live and breathe it, and hopefully you can live with what you've done, or what you haven't done in many instances.
Can I just get your thoughts, as both of us have served in Afghanistan? Can I just get your thoughts on the initial purpose of that campaign, and did that really align or set ourselves up for success for the eventual, way that campaign disintegrated, and what you bring back to some of this sense of moral injuries with our soldiers nowadays?
I mean, I think at least what I'm able to capture from the people that I've interviewed over the last 2.5 years, and Afghanistan has obviously been in my focus quite often. The initial reasons were understandable. Of course, going to pursue a particular threat group, Al Qaeda. No problem with that morally and ethically. And I think anybody that went in those first couple of years went so without any moral questions, right? Despite the fact that it was rather emotional, it was revenge, but it was also, to use military jargon, prosecuting a legitimate target, right? Ultimately, what it shifted to is regime change, and that's where the ethical piece really comes into it. I mean, was that a legitimate use of military might, military power, military force to institute a regime change, with not as much as a deliberate, well-developed long-term plan where all the parties had a stake in that plan? And I've spoken to many a general, some publicly, who've openly discussed that Australia didn't have a seat at the table in the strategy definition of certainly Afghanistan, but even Iraq, and that for us is at least for me, ethically, is a problem, right? If we're putting soldiers into harm's way, and as somebody who was a civilian in war, putting non-combatants at the receiving end of our own munitions, who will ultimately count as collateral damage, because we're fully justified, under various doctrines to, ultimately kill them if it's for a greater good, quote unquote. Well, it's for them. It's also about them. It really matters for them, because we'll come back home. We'll come back to our functioning society, to our, lovely beaches, and, a set of traffic lights where everybody stops, and when a police officer pulls you over, everybody pulls over, etc. The ordered society and social norms that we live by. But those people will not, right? They will, if they live, will return to a place that is totally disrupted, not just their physical infrastructure, but their social connections, the social networks that had existed will be completely disrupted, severed, and that takes generations to heal. So for that reason alone, I think the purpose one goes, to a particular deployment matters. And I think as we kind of look backwards, there's certainly some, at least in my view, there's some room for improvement as to how we go to war, which I know is not really what the podcast is about. It's about how we relate this to business, but I think we can really draw tenuous links to business. Firstly, let's face it, let's not over rely on the superiority of the military mindset. We have come, and this is again my opinion, we have become too accustomed to overusing the military and relying on the military mindset. But as David Kilcullen, who undoubtedly most in your audience will be familiar with, said in a recent interview, we haven't won a war since World War II, right? So for all our
nobility
praising, yeah, that's right. So at some point we need to stop and think and okay, how are we relying too much, and are we becoming the idiom, right? That if all you got a hammer, all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Are we falling for that trap, right?
Yeah.
The Einstein effect, right? So,
and is our pious self-righteousness actually leading to the end states that we want to get to? And,
exactly.
It's one of the things. One of the things I like to say on your point there is that in terms of collateral damage, and every life is precious. Whether it's mine's very precious to me, and when you have, whether you're a combatant or not, the long-term consequences of what happens in the inverted commas enemy's family, even though we're both doing our thing for what we believe in.
That's right. Everybody thinks they're the good guy, right?
When we've got in World War I, we've got Christians on one side of the trench praying to the same God as the English on the other side of the trench. It's I'm going to spin this around a bit. So first of all, coming back to the point about Afghanistan and my own personal experience was, I remember being challenged by people about the army and the war, prior to my deployment. And I always had this thing, about, hey, girls can go to schools now. We're building roads, and, we were able to cling on to these physical and capability things that we were doing for a change in the country. And I've got to say, seeing those iconic scenes of, our generation's Huey helicopters being pushed off the back, where, these tragic scenes of these Afghanis falling off the wheel bays of C-17s, and reflecting on my experience of what was it right or not? It's actually going to lead me into my next point. And I believe it was Machiavelli who said it, but the ends justify the means. And this is where I want to tie this thing into business, and why it's so important to look at military and ethics and business as separate things. And I'm going to draw you to your point: anomaly versus life as normal. In business, this is life as normal. These are the things that we do, act, behave, say every single day. Let's talk about the ends justify the means. And can you just, as a military ethicist, how do you manage this in your profession?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. I mean, it's something that I've tried to wrestle with. The idea of there's a risk out there, right? And humor me here, and please, challenge me if you disagree. But there's a broadly, let's call it militarization of everything, right? Just think about the Australian context. The last couple of years, we've had a 2-star general heading up just about everything, whether it's a COVID task force,
vaccinations,
everything, right? Vaccinations, door knocks, right? We had special forces soldiers doing door knocks, right, to make sure that people are vaccinated. Bushfire assist, flood assist. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that we should be there as a force of last resort, which is what the strategic review now says, right? But there's been a tendency to throw the military at just about any problem that is faced by the government, and this is not a way to shame the government or accuse the government. It's understandable why, because as military people, what are we trained in, right? Now, I'm just going to draw back to our old the values that we were brought up with, right? Courage, initiative, teamwork. As much as I know that have changed now, but I just don't want to confuse the point that I'm trying to make, right? Initiative is probably the biggest one that stands out in my mind as to what we were trained as young officers joining the Australian military. Everything was about, make a decision, just go, make a decision, do something, don't stand there and freeze. And this is something that I've recognized as an inherent value in military service that I've been able to take outside and recognize that in particular as a real standout trait that we bring to the party. Now that it therefore makes sense why the government, besides the fact that it's ultimately a free resource, right? One that you're already paying for, that you can throw at just about any problem. But that you're going to get a solution, because that's what these people are trained to do. So therefore, we have a solution for, COVID task force, for flood assist, for bushfire assist, and despite the fact that we're exhausting quite precious resources that are designed and ultimately exist for a completely different end state. But more to the point, we're also seeing a promulgation of military jargon, even the name of your podcast, right? And this is not to say that this is I'm not trying to hit your podcast, but the military mindset is permeating through business everywhere, right? Everywhere you look, But there's an inherent risk that one needs to be aware that comes with that. If you militarize everything, then things start to look like war. And if you start using terminology like targets, prosecuting, etc., which is terminology that is used in the military context to desensitize the warfighter to the act of killing, taking a human life, right? We're calling him a target or an objective for a reason. The language desensitizes you progressively over time to the fact that you are taking someone's father, someone's son, someone's husband, that you're taking their life, or that, collateral damage in itself, that you're deleting an entire family potentially, right? These are serious issues that militaries have to contend with. And that's part of what military ethics tries to do, is to give us a little bit of an increased awareness and an edge as to how we think about the application of lethal force. But when you take that into the business context, just like you said before, right? Ends justify the means. If you start thinking that, you're in a war, that you are in an operation center, that this is, and you see the language all the time, you're in the trenches. There's this kind of idea of battle as business. There's a risk, and I'm not saying this happens everywhere, but there's a risk that you start really, it becomes about killing the opposition.
Yeah.
Right, which is that kind of, and that allows you then slowly over time, progressively, to start using methods and ways to achieve that end state that may otherwise not be, legal, and that's easy. Legal's easy, but there will be.
Legal doesn't mean right.
That's right, exactly right. But that's an easy kind of box. Okay, is this legal? Yes, tick, cool. But is it ethical or unethical? And it becomes blurry once you start using language that is all about war. Victory at all costs. It's me against them. Whereas, as you know much better than I do, right? In business, competition is healthy, right? And it's about improving so that the others improve, so the you improve, so the industry improves. And we all know the dangers of a monopoly, right? When all competition has been killed, right?
It's funny. I really, really appreciating when we say that, because, too often in sports, we talk about, combat and that, in sports, it's so far from someone like, and again, I almost have to justify this every time. Individual experiences vary in the army, and I'm not a combat.
Yes.
And
same.
I say that particularly out of respect to the men and women that are in those roles and have faced those challenges. But in business, it is always the right thing to do the right thing. And this is where, I sort of see three levels of available intelligence, to summarize them really cleanly, about how we look at our competition. And just one thing about competition, some of the best relationships we've had have been with competitors who we now turn into collaborators.
Yes,
because if you're actually so competitive with someone that's such a finite, small view of the world, that in fact you're good at what you do because you do it. They might be in the same space, but how big is the pie you're looking at?
Exactly.
So quite often with our competitors / collaborators, what are the opportunities there? So for example, in our business, we've just created a product which is called the HubSpot Virtual Assistant Academy. So we can provide trained talent to our competitors so they can do a great job with their clients.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's actually opportunities here when we look at this. They're not the enemy.
That's right.
They're not the enemy.
Right. Yeah.
They're business people.
But when you start, exactly. But when you infuse we've seen this time and time again, what competitiveness or over competitiveness has done to businesses, starting most prominently from the global financial crisis in 2008, some of the big companies that failed was because of the focus on targets only, right? So it's all about, it's all about victory, right? It's all about, getting out there and getting it done, which is, again, that's what, when it's a matter of life and death, sure. When it's a matter of life and death of your nation, sure. When it's a matter of life and death of your social group, your family, sure. But business needs to be removed, I think, or needs to be at least toned down. This is not to say that there aren't useful skills. I mean, in intelligence, obviously, business intelligence and the entire intelligence cycle as a principle is a hugely beneficial, it's hugely beneficial knowledge to bring into a business. And I know from my own partner, she we were in Sweden for a couple of years, as you know, and she was consulting for a company and being contracted out to analyze the workings of another company. And having spent some time in that other company now, she basically did a center of gravity analysis, center of gravity construct analysis, right? Analyzing, their critical capabilities, critical requirements, critical vulnerabilities, etc. Presented that to the CEO of the company, and he just, bought her outright. Like he just went, "Yep, cool. You're coming on board now. You're going to work for me now. I'm going to, pay you out from the other company because this is something that I've never seen before, and it makes so much sense because I can now look at what the weaknesses of my competitors are, and I can account for those and beat them."
Yeah.
Fantastic insight, but you need to couch it in such a way that it's not about, you're not killing people, and you need to remove the language that might somehow imply that this is a war of survival, right? Which is I feel like permeating more and more in that kind of business speak.
I want to work hard. I want to win. I want to be successful. But there's ways that we can do that, right? And I've created a little sort of 3S framework on a very simple guide to what's right and what's wrong here. So strip, steal, sabotage, right, is the way I look at it. If you want to look at how the military does intelligence and investigates, competitor analysis to give yourself every advantage, then there's nothing wrong with stripping everything that's out there in the public forum. If I guarantee you that Qantas knows what Jetstar's Virgin's flight fares are from Sydney to Melbourne. So anytime your competitors put stuff out in the open source world, strip it, get as much as you can, because it's been released with free spirit, and you should be taking as much of that information as you can to be able to make your decisions. So I got no problems with strip. Okay, that's
agreed.
It's just a good straight intelligence. But then we've got a threshold underneath, which is steal. Okay, and then we've spoken about this little one before. The steal bit is where I have to actually take on that persona of manipulation or fraud in somehow. Is it actually okay for me to lie to get information, or to take stuff that is protected or guarded? Now, is it legal? Probably, maybe, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with me pretending to be someone and lying in a phone call to get information out of my. There's nothing legally wrong with that. But I think as soon as we take these steps and we cross this integrity threshold,
yeah, exactly.
Now we're creeping down the wrong path.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I think I couldn't agree more. And sabotage obviously goes without saying. That's the ultimate. But these are in war. All of these are fine, right? Because the stakes in war and business are vastly different. And when the two are blended and merged, so does blur the line between what is war and business. And it's therefore far easier for people to justify stealing. Oh, well, I'm just pretending to be someone I'm not. I mean, it's not that big.
I'm not breaking the law.
I'm not breaking the law. That's right.
I'm not doing anything illegal.
And it's a slippery slope, right? It's this kind of and again, this is something we see in war and we see in business, right? When behavior is normalized, that's when it starts degrading even further. And when you can disguise certain activities and behaviors through language that kind of neuter its emotional loading, like targeting. I'm just targeting the competitors, right? That could mean anything.
What that actual word target means.
Exactly, right?
It actually means look it through a scope or aim a weapon at it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I think this language is so super important because, again, it creates a desensitization to the effects. Yeah. And I just short-term win versus long-term gain. I just don't see. Now, there's too many examples of where it's infused into a company's culture. Yeah. The walls come crashing down sooner or later.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's my
Obviously,
only warning with it. I mean, that's it from a kind of, again, ethical perspective. I mean, it's something that I'm, and you refer to me as a military ethicist. I mean, I'm a military ethicist in it, in his infancy, I guess. But just the research that I'm looking at is I'm looking at the role of the environment, how the environment can degrade our moral compass. Obviously, for the military context, it's more on operations, but the same can be applied. And I've done and I've read a lot of research on, how easily our moral compass can be pulled in a different direction, right? And of course, incentives matter, right? The behavior that you incentivize is the behavior you're going to get. And if again, we've seen this time and time again through the failures of many an organization, ethical failures, when you're incentivizing certain actions, like, winning at any cost, that's what you're going to get. And when that's encouraged, that's what you're going to get. So setting those, creating the conditions and the environment, business environment that is fierce, no question of that, competitive, 100%, get out there and win. Yeah, no problem. But you do need to have certain guardrails that will shape what's acceptable behavior and what's not. And of course, turning a blind eye to small deviations, well, that leads to greater deviations. And that's perhaps, something that I guess the military is learning, where the costs are much higher. But of course, the business world also needs to learn.
and it's this constant deviation that is okay, there's that line you cross, but then it's the constant, as soon as you cross it, the line just starts creeping and creeping and creeping. And what was abnormal, abhorrent, or unusual before, now it's all of like, oh, that's okay. It's just what we roll now. And this line just continues to creep and creep. And this is the challenge that soldiers have, like the first time they go to operations, there's things that they might do that are just so foreign or just unheard of, like in our normal society, but in the anomaly of warfare, they're doing things that are just you shouldn't be killing people in the normal society. It just shouldn't happen. Soldiers, it can be part of their daily activity. But then they go to deployment 2 and 3 and 4, and constantly the things that they're challenged to do in the name of our country just keep creeping and creeping. And it's so hard for us, for civilians, to throw and cast judgment at people that have been in those experiences. And again, coming back to your first point, this is the anomaly of warfare. This is not an excuse to take this kind of behavior into business.
That's right. No.
Okay. So obviously the sabotage piece is just not on, but even though I would suggest it is prevalent out there. And I was
100%.
I was talking to someone quite recently, and he was talking about in one of his first gigs, he was trying to sell mobile phones in another country, competing with Nokia, and he couldn't compete because they just had so many resources. So what he started doing was booking all of their reps into places way out of town, doing fake appointments for them. So then all of a sudden, all the reps turning up, like basically intentionally sabotaging. But ultimately, that company couldn't win or compete anyway because they had an inferior product.
Yeah.
So for me, it's this short-term versus long-term gain. And I guess my other point on the steal bit is, as a father of 2 young boys, 7 and 4-year-old, that classic old verse, do unto others as they would have done unto you, I think it is.
Yeah.
The behaviors that we do in business, what if I just take that from my competitor? Are we opening up, the can of worms here?
Yeah, that's a really funny one, right? Because and again, there's ample of research supporting this. But how we're able to segregate or compartmentalize what we do in business or even in war to what we do at home, right? So you can be a perfectly reasonable father, mother, who's teaching your children the right values about stealing, about looking after others, etc. But you could then go to work and be immersed in an environment where this is completely normalized and okay, and therefore commit. In some instances, grave atrocities, right? I mean, we've all read about the keepers of Auschwitz, right? Who'd exterminate thousands by day and then go home to their families and sing Christmas carols, right, with their sons and daughters, and take lovely photographs, next to Auschwitz. And I mean, I can just give you an anecdote to this, where the environment shaped behavior. right? When we were in Bosnia, when we were running as you alluded to this, at the start, we opened the country's first CrossFit gym. And setting that up, we set it up as a not-for-profit, and running it was an adventure, to say the least, right? In a post-violent conflict nation like Bosnia, but as we were getting established, and it was going really well. The sport grew rapidly, and our membership base grew rapidly. But I was then approached by somebody who I hold in very high esteem, somebody who is otherwise a very moral person. I would never, and an extraordinarily hardworking person. And I mean, 12-hour days, day in, day out, has his own company, etc. He approached me with an idea to, submit proposals for EU funding to use our gym to do, because it was, in his words, at the time, to do female-only gym classes. They'll give us money to build an entire venue, a new venue, and he's got all the providers and all the repairers and all the labor, all the trades, access to all the trades that are, of course, going to give us a bill for 4 times the amount it actually costs to build it, right? So you charge the EU, I don't know, for argument's sake, 10,000 euro, but it actually only costs you 4,000 euro. You make 6,000 euro. Now, the way he was explaining this to him, it wasn't even he didn't even skip a beat. He didn't even skip a beat.
Free money. Easy.
Exactly. But that's the parallel economy that exists there, right? Because of the way, the I guess, foreign influence has been, exploited, etc., in Bosnia on multiple levels, right, for benefit of a multitude of people. But that's part of it, right? It's so normalized that it's so much so that on the receiving end, you account for, a bit of corruption or a bit of money that's going to go off to the side. Yeah. That's part of it, right? And that started somewhere. That started with, let's just up it a little bit. Let's just up it by 500 euro. Next thing you're talking, 6,000 euro, and you have established an entire parallel economy. And that really happens.
What's the difference between 6 and 8 or 8 and 10? And it just creeps and creeps and creeps.
And then the sentence which we hear time and time again, what's 6,000 to them? What's 6,000 to EU? What's the 6,000 to UK, US? And we see this in Australia with our own tax returns, right? It is almost a rite of passage to pay as little tax as you can in Australia, right? Like, as in, the government's not using it anyway. You justify it in a way that, they're not, the roads aren't fixed anyway, right? But then you go to a country like Sweden, which is where we lived for nearly 3 years. It is a source of national pride that everybody pays their tax. In fact, you don't even do a tax return. The government just charges you tax, and only if you have something legitimate to claim, you have to go and do it all yourself. It's not a requirement. Everything's done for you. It's only if you have some legitimate claims that you need to make, you don't have to go and submit a tax return. And if you are in some way perceived as cheating on your tax, that is a source of national shame or shaming within your peer group. Whereas for us, it's the opposite, right? It's you got one up on the government kind of thing.
This is where I think it's an important point probably to wrap up in terms of our own moral compass. We are products of our community, and we are so blessed to be in a community like Australia, a law-based community where there is some very clear, right and wrongs, not just legal or not legals. Other people in the world don't have this, and particularly other countries where corruption is part of, our morality and their morality. It can't necessarily just pick us up and put us over there or transfer their beliefs or value sets into our culture. But what we do have is the ability to make our own decisions for ourselves on what's right and wrong. And, coming back, I encourage everyone, do the right thing in business, look at your competitors potentially as collaborators, and ultimately, be the kind of person that, that can. The problem is, I guess I was going to say sleep well at night, but some people can sleep well at night doing the wrong thing anyway. So ultimately, man, I've just appreciated the ability to share. I guess I'll summarize. All I can do is talk for myself. And in my experience and the choices that I want to make is that I want to work hard. I want to win. I want to compete. I want to use the values that were infused into me as being a professional military officer at the time to do the right thing. And so far, so good. We're succeeding because of that, not in spite of that. So, mate, can I leave you for a final word? And like, I'd love to come back and talk again, because this just scratches the surface. Tell us about the other work you're doing, Voices of War, and how people can find you.
So main focus now is really, starting my researcher journey. But I do spend a fair bit of time trying to put together this podcast. As I said, it is one of my gripes, having experienced war firstly as a child, then as a soldier, then I've been to Afghanistan, to Iraq as a development worker, and saw kind of the aftermath of that tragic war in Iraq and the disruption of that society. I'm convinced that we have a tendency to go to war far too easily, far too quickly. And it's something, again, I address on the pod. Recently I had a prominent Australian ambassador to just about every country in the Middle East, who spoke at length about how we went to Iraq as an example, right? How, in my view, and in his view, and in view of many others, it was an unethical thing for us to go to that war. But that's something that we don't address publicly. That's not something that's perhaps discussed in exclusive circles, but it's not in our public discourse, amongst the population who we ultimately serve. And that's what the pod is aimed to do, is to try to pass between these very simple, kind of highly moralistic discussions on war. Yes, we're going because we're fighting for freedom and democracy, right? That's the standard throwaway. Well, what's below that? And, is that sufficient? A slogan to motivate people to go and kill others. People can find the pod on, thevoicesofwar.com. Of course, it's on all, regular podcatchers, etc. That's what I kind of spend my time doing.
Mate, we'll throw it in the show notes as well. Thanks for sharing your time today. It's really been an eye opener for me. Again, talking about some of these, points are really important, and ultimately will drive your success and your legacy. Not just your success, but your legacy, which I think is really important. Thanks again, Maz. Military Mindset for Podcast. My name's Pete Liston.